Welcome to the Explainer. So, if you're a focused learner who's been struggling with creeping fatigue, maybe some stubborn belly fat that literally just won't budge no matter what you do, or you're just noticing that your body simply doesn't bounce back and recover like it used to, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating protocol, one that promises to target these exact issues using a single, non-patented compound over the course of just 4 weeks. Okay, let's dive right into this. Now, you might be wondering, can one single unpatented compound actually reset three major biological systems in just 4 weeks? Honestly, it sounds a little impossible, right? Or at least like some wild internet marketing claim. But what we're exploring today is actually rooted firmly in clinical literature. We're looking at a compound called Thymoquinone, which is derived from black seed oil, and how the data shows it can measurably impact your stem cells, your senescent cells, and your visceral fat. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the black seed reset and the daily 3-step protocol. Then, we'll break down the biology chronologically, restoring stem cells in the morning, clearing cellular weeds at midday, and burning visceral fat in the evening. And finally, we'll look at the hard evidence and results. All right, part 1, the black seed reset, where we unlock the power of Thymoquinone. So, what exactly is this compound? And if it's really so powerful, why hasn't your primary care doctor mentioned it? Well, Thymoquinone is the primary bioactive constituent of cold-pressed Nigella sativa, which is more commonly known as black seed oil. Now, here is a number that should absolutely shock you. Over 2,000. That's how many published academic studies exist on this stuff as of 2024. So why isn't it mainstream? Simply put, because it can't be patented. No pharmaceutical company can own it, which means there's no massive commercial budget to push it into clinical adoption. But it boasts incredible academic literature, including some foundational trials like Catter 2009 and Mahmood 2019, which we're going to dig into shortly. Moving right into part 2, the daily 3-step protocol. Action before biology. I want to give you the exact actionable steps right up front before we get bogged down in all the complex cellular science. Here is the protocol, really clear and simple. It's 3 tablespoons total across the day. Step 1, a tablespoon in the morning with breakfast. Step 2, a tablespoon midday with lunch. And step 3, a tablespoon in the evening with dinner. Now, it is absolutely crucial that these are heavily anchored to your meals. Why? Because thymoquinone is fat soluble. It literally requires the bioproduction that eating a meal triggers in order to be absorbed properly into your system. Now, before we go any further, there are a few critical sourcing and safety caveats you need to know. The oil absolutely must be cold pressed. You're looking for a dark amber or brown color. Those pale oils, they lack the required thymoquinone. Also, never heat or cook with this stuff, because heat destroys the bioactive compound entirely. As for the taste, expect a very strong, peppery, earthy flavor. It is definitely not mild. And this is important. If you are on anticoagulant medications or if you don't have a gallbladder, you've got to check with your physician first. The fat absorption and mild blood thinning properties definitely change the safety profile for you. Okay, part 3, morning, restoring stem cells. Let's talk NRF2 activation. Let's look at the actual biological mechanism for that very first morning dose and why it specifically targets the repair systems in our body that naturally start to decline with age. This brings us to NRF2. Think of NRF2 as your body's master antioxidant switch. Thymoquinone directly activates NRF2, essentially flipping a switch that turns on a cascade of roughly 200 protective genes all at the same time. It turns your cells into an internal pharmaceutical factory, pumping out massive amounts of glutathione, which is your body's primary internal antioxidant. So right off the bat, it's aggressively cleaning up all that oxidative stress that's been building up. So why does this massive cellular cleanup actually matter? Well, it restores stem cell quiescence. Your stem cells, whether they're hanging out in your bone marrow or your intestinal crypts, they are incredibly sensitive to oxidative stress. When there's just too much free radical noise around them, they either divide incorrectly or just too rarely. By using that morning dose to activate NRF2 and quiet down that oxidative noise, your stem cells can finally rest properly in their dormant state. And that leads to much faster, far more precise tissue repair when they actually do need to divide. Which brings us to part 4. Midday, clearing cellular weeds, the cellulysis process. That second tablespoon you take with lunch, that maintains your plasma levels and targets a completely different problem happening in aging tissue. I want you to think of your body like a garden bed. Over time, you inevitably accumulate senescent cells. These are the weeds. They're cells that have permanently stopped dividing, but they absolutely refuse to die. Instead, they just sit there crowding out precious resources and constantly secreting these highly inflammatory molecules called SASP. On the flip side, you have your functional cells. Those are the plants actually trying to grow and repair. Now, if your tissue is completely full of weeds, the stem cell repair we triggered in the morning, it literally cannot take root. So obviously, we need to do some weeding. We call this senolysis. This is a highly targeted biological weeding process that clears out those stubborn senescent cells through programmed cell death, or apoptosis. That midday dose of thymoquinone actively clears these weeds out of your cellular environment by promoting senolysis via your AMPK and SIT1 pathways. All right, part 5. Evening. Burning visceral fat. Disrupting the inflammatory loop. Now we arrive at the dinner dose. Visceral fat, that's the dangerous, stubborn fat that accumulates deep around your internal organs, it creates this highly inflammatory feedback loop that standard caloric restriction alone often fails to break. But thymoquinone interrupts this vicious cycle at 3 very distinct points. First, that NRF2 activation we talked about, it reduces the inflammatory output directly from the fat cells themselves. Second, it induces programmed cell death via caspase-3, literally telling specific fat cells to eliminate themselves entirely rather than just shrinking them. And third, the AMPK activation increases the actual metabolic burning of stored fat, and it does this partially independent of how many calories you're currently eating. Pretty amazing, right? Finally, part 6, the evidence and results. Because we want this grounded in literature, not just marketing. Let's anchor everything we've just discussed back to the clinical data to prove that this is a real systemic biological intervention and not just a placebo effect. 19. That is the number of independent studies analyzed in the massive Hassan 2023 review that confirmed thymoquinone's direct NRF2 activation across multiple organ systems. So we're not basing this on a single lucky outlier paper. This is a highly documented, well-understood biological pathway. What is incredibly compelling here is the multi-marker consistency. Take the Mahmoud 2019 randomized control trial, which involved 90 subjects over 3 months. The results showed statistically significant reductions in visceral adipose tissue and waist-to-hip ratio, right alongside improved fasting insulin and really positive shifts in lipid profiles. Now, these results weren't some magical overnight 30-pound weight loss, but they were incredibly consistent across multiple markers all at the same time. And that proves this is a real systemic effect happening deep inside the biology. If you're actually going to try this out, you need to set some realistic expectations. Day 1 is when you start the 3 tablespoons daily. By day 10 to 14, the literature suggests you'll start to notice a real shift in your morning energy. This is your glutathione levels rising and all that cellular friction disappearing. But it's not until week 3 or 4 that you should expect to see a measurable reduction in your waist circumference, because it takes a minute for that visceral fat mechanism to really take hold. You know, in clinical literature, there's a saying, when 4 independent biomarkers move in the predicted direction in a randomized controlled trial, the effect is almost certainly real. The absolute genius of this protocol is how those 3 doses compound on each other throughout the day. The morning dose cleans up the cellular environment, which then makes the midday senolysis weeding process much more effective, which in turn improves your insulin sensitivity so that evening fat burn isn't just fighting an uphill battle. So the crucial takeaway here is that you need to treat this like a real experiment on your own biology. Grab a tape measure and track your waist circumference weekly. Subjectively track your morning energy every 3 days. If the data moves in 4 weeks, you keep going, because biological interventions like this are ongoing inputs, not just one-time magic corrections. But hey, if it doesn't move, you stop. You have honest data, so you get to make an informed choice. I want to leave you with this final thought. Are you ready to actually track your data and run a 4-week experiment on your own biology? The scientific literature we've seen today is incredibly generous, existing entirely outside the commercial pharmaceutical pipeline. The mechanisms are clear, the steps are totally actionable, and the results are entirely measurable. This is literally preventative information just waiting to be used.